Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, all part of the Embedded Research Project. And I think we're going to have a fascinating 58 minutes ahead of us. More on that in a second. So I'm Richard Taunt.
I'm Alison Seeger.
And we're joined by two different parts, or at least two different geographical parts of St Andrews today. Vicky and Tricia, welcome. Thanks very much for joining.
Good to be here, thank you.
And a human minute, are you upstairs or downstairs from Vicky?
Downstairs. Yeah. Yeah.
They're downstairs. We put them in the basement.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, that this is all done for smooth running of your webinar pleasure today. This is not some symbol, I'm presuming. How are you interrelate? But just so that everything is clear and audible for you today. So what's the purpose of today? Well, thank you for joining, and thank you particularly if you've come back from watching the first webinar in this series, which was all about an introduction to what this embedded research thing even is. So in that webinar, which you're able to watch back if you didn't join then, we talked a bit about the concept, a couple of ways it's being put into practice. Today's webinar sort of goes a step further, and it sort of talks about sort of what are some of the options, what are some of the variables in terms of embedded research projects, and how, if you are wanting to set out thinking about an embedded research approach, where you would start, and what are some of the questions you would think through. I mentioned earlier that this is part of this ongoing research project, and it's great. I'm really looking forward to actually hearing, I think, St Andrews team, for the very first time, some of the early outputs of that work. So whether you're joining us live today or whether you're watching back later on, you're getting a bit of an exclusive. So thank you again. We hope you have a really constructive time with us. So we'll be running this. There'll be presentations from our team, but also we are going to be taking your questions, your views. Alison, how can people get involved?
There are three ways to get involved with us. You can use the Ask Question feature and just type in your question. I'll be fielding the questions and directing them to the appropriate person to answer them. You can email us at hello@kaleidoscope.healthcare, and you can tweet us. The username is _embedded. We're using the hashtag embedded research today, which we've used for all our websites. And the website for the embedded project is Embedded Research, and you can go there to find all of our past webinar videos and more information about the project.
So whether this is your first interaction with this whole project, or you've scoured every single page on the website, read every single bit of content, thanks very much for joining us, and do use this as a way to find out even more. So we'll start with presentations, but then we would love your questions, reflections as we go through, and possibly just as a starter, just to check that all of those bits of technology are working. If you wanted to just send us a quick email, so hello@kaleidoscope.healthcare, or just pop in the text, who you are, where you're joining from, and if you want to give us a weather report from where you are. St Andrews team, I believe it's beautiful where you are.
It is very lovely and cold.
What a surprise! St Andrews, cold in January. Here in South London, it's a bit cloudy, but it's not too bad. So do just send us a quick email, say who you are, why you're joining, and if you want to give us a weather report as well, that would be lovely. And we'll come back to those later on. I think without any further ado, we will start. So Hugh, I think you're going to begin.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Richard. And it falls to me to set the scene a little for this webinar today, and recognising that not everyone who's joining us today has been involved in previous episodes. So it all really starts because we know that when it comes to improving healthcare services and improving public health, that there's lots of research-based knowledge that doesn't get fully used at a local level. And there's lots of new knowledge possibilities in local systems that currently remain relatively untapped. But we also know that sharing and using knowledge of whatever form is a deeply social and situated process. And it's a process that needs to be supported and a process that needs to be facilitated. And it's because of these insights that many people have become interested in closer relations between research-savvy people and local service delivery personnel and personnel in other parts of the health system. And one way of achieving such closer relations is to embed researchers in various parts of that healthcare system. And we know that this goes on, but we don't know much about where it goes on, how it works, and to what extent, or even why it might have some of the beneficial impacts that we hope. So our study then lays the foundation for a better understanding of these processes. First of all, we've been scoping out where such schemes seem to be happening in the United Kingdom. And second, we've been exploring, both from the schemes directly and from the literature, how they're being constructed. And we've done this first by using our networks and social media to discover what's happening across the UK in health-related settings, and then interviewing participants to hear more, and by carrying out systematic literature review and analysis to explore more deeply the thinking that lies behind such schemes. What concepts are invoked? What models, theories and frameworks have people found useful? And it's our pleasure today to share some of that with you, with a particular emphasis, as Richard said, on what needs to be thought about as such schemes get designed. What do we need to think through in order to be able to prepare a design of such a scheme? Can I take the next slide, please, Richard? So before handing over to Vicky, who's going to tell you what we've found, we first want to acknowledge the support from our funders, the National Institute for Health Service for Health Research, and note, of course, the usual disclaimer that the findings that we present here are findings from the research team and not necessarily the views of that funder. So now, passing on to Vicky, what's been happening?
Great. Thanks for that fantastic overview, Hugh. That was really useful, just to set the scene a little bit. And if I can have the first slide, please, Rich, that's fabulous. So what I would like to do now is really give you a quick whistle-stop tour of where embedded research initiatives are going on in the UK and what they're like. So, as I explained in our last webinar, we identified 45 embedded research initiatives across the UK. And as you can see from this slide, they were spread pretty much right across the UK, with the highest concentration in the South East and Midlands. Now, of course, this isn't a complete picture of all the initiatives that exist, just those that we managed to find through using our networks, email lists, and social media. So, the next slide, please. Thank you. So, looking at this slide, we can see that the initiatives that we identified, those 45 initiatives, they were fairly diverse. They were going on in a range of healthcare settings, ranging from community and primary care through to third sector or other organisations. And some initiatives actually didn't confine themselves to one particular setting, but worked across areas. So there were some initiatives that were working in acute and community settings, or community and primary care settings. The initiatives were taking place across quite a big range of timeframes. We expected that some of them would be quite short, but we actually found that the vast majority were taking place over 2 or more years. And some initiatives were very long-standing indeed. Over 30 years, one of the initiatives that were identified had been going on. And similarly, we also thought that most initiatives would be looking at one project, focusing on the delivery of a single project. And that's the diagram that you can see at the bottom that says scale. Perhaps those would be service evaluations or standalone piece of service improvement work. But what we actually found was that the majority of initiatives that we identified comprised a portfolio of projects. And both of these two things in the centre of our slide tell us that many embedded research initiatives in the UK are actually relatively substantial and come probably with a significant infrastructure. And finally, we also expected that most embedded researchers would have joint contracts of employment with university and their health service organisations or host organisations. But we actually found that the majority were directly employed by universities, with a large number only holding NHS contracts. So that, again, was a little bit different to what we expected to see. Can I have the next slide, please, Rich?
Just to say, if people are poring over the slides, that if on the GoToWebinar handouts tab, you can download a copy for in-depth and later perusal. If you're joining later on and want to get a copy of the slides, just email us hello@clydescott.healthcare and we'll send those on. Vicky, sorry, back to you.
Fabulous, thank you. So I've given you a bit of a picture about the embedded research initiatives that we identified and some of the surprises which we've had as a team. And actually what we want to spend a bit of time on really in the rest of the webinar though is exploring some of the insights which have arisen when we've dug a bit deeper into these initiatives and then other embedded research initiatives through our review of the literature, looking at documents that people have kindly provided us with and talking to some of the people who are involved in embedded research initiatives. And what we've come to realise is that there are a number of ways that embedded research initiatives can be distinguished from each other. And these fall into three broad categories, which you can see on this slide. The intent, which underpins the initiative, so the kinds of things that the initiative is designed to achieve, what's going on under the surface really. The structure of the initiative, so how it's organised, and the processes which are inherent in the initiative, the kinds of activities which are actually going on within it. And what we're suggesting today is that as well as helping us to distinguish between the different initiatives that we've identified, we think that these features can help people who are looking to set up an embedded research initiative to consider the different design options which are actually open to them. So we've taken our insights and we've tried to make them practical for people who are thinking about planning an initiative moving into the future. And I'm going to focus on the first two, the intent. Bennett's going to focus on structure, and then Trisha's going to focus on processes. So, thinking about the intent underneath the initiatives that we've identified. The first design option is around the intended outcome or benefit of the initiative. And we may think that that seems quite obvious, you know, that you'll have an obvious idea about what it is that you want something to achieve. And we came into this thinking as well that, you know, the main intended outcome would be the development of knowledge. But actually, when we dug a little bit deeper, we found that there were a range of different intents underpinning the different initiatives. The first intent is to develop insights from local practice, and we saw this in initiatives which focused on evaluating a local service, as well as those which supported ongoing service improvement and practice development within a health service setting. The second possible intended outcome or benefit is to develop more formal or generalisable forms of knowledge which can be applied to different settings or organisations. And this was the case in initiatives which were focusing on delivering NIHR-funded research, for instance. The third possible outcome is an increased capability and capacity to produce knowledge within the health service setting. And this knowledge includes both insights from local practice and more formal research type knowledge. And the final possible outcome was a bit of a surprise to us, to be honest, but was very real in both the literature that we looked at and the data which we collected. And this was about maintaining or increasing the prestige and credibility either of the healthcare or of the academic organisation. So an example of this would be an embedded researcher with a remit to produce knowledge about the outcomes and performance of a service which could be used to seek or maintain funding for that service. And we had at least two specific examples as where this was one of the main intended outcomes of an initiative. So moving on to the next slide. The next design option very much underpins many of the other design options and deals with the political and power dynamics associated with an initiative. And there's two ways of thinking about these dynamics. The first is the intended effect of the initiative on some of the more traditional roles and relationships that we see between academia and practice. And some initiatives are very much designed to disrupt roles and relationships by privileging forms and sources of knowledge which are being overlooked in that particular setting, such as perhaps patient feedback or the experience of nurses, for instance. Others seek to challenge roles and relationships, perhaps by bringing these kind of inequalities into focus and drawing it to people's attention. Others might seek to rebalance roles and relationships, perhaps by involving healthcare staff in collecting and analysing data. Or you might choose to maintain traditional roles and relationships, with researchers continuing to take the lead with producing knowledge and healthcare partners continuing to act as knowledge users. The other way of thinking about political and power dynamics, though, is in relation to the various aspects of power that are at play within an initiative. And we saw that there were 3 types of power at play in initiatives: control, contribution, and gain. Control requires us to ask who's in control of things like the researcher's time, the resources, or the ways in which knowledge will be produced. Contribution begs the question, who contributes to this initiative and what do they contribute? Is it knowledge, money, time? And gain leads us to ask, who stands to gain from this initiative? Is it predominantly the researchers, the health service organisation, patients and service users? These are all questions which are there designed to help people to think about these things, and they are really useful ways of distinguishing between the initiatives that we've found. So I've explored some of the intent which can underpin an initiative, and I'm now going to hand you over to Bennett, who's going to take you through the structural design options.
Lovely, thanks very much, Vicky. So yes, as Vicky says, after the intent and before Tricia speaks about processes, I'm going to talk about structure. And there's 4 dimensions, 4 aspects of structure, which we're calling scale. That's the top left icon there. PPI, which is patient and public involvement. That's the top right. Proximity, that's the bottom left icon. And home, which is the bottom right icon. And the scale and the PPI, that's the top 2, we think about as applying to the level of initiatives and projects, whereas the proximity and home apply more at the individual level of the embedded researcher. So scale first. Next slide, please, Richard, thank you. So in terms of the scale of the work, we might be considering, for example, a single project that stands alone, such as a service evaluation, as Vicky's mentioned. And in that case, we might ask how long a duration is needed to complete that project. Or it might be a selection of projects addressing particular areas of practical interest, or a portfolio of projects. So then each of those will also be taking place in a known time frame and managed in a time frame. Or often we found initiatives which were open-ended, signalling a more ongoing and sustained relationship between practice and research. And then, of course, you can ask how many projects will coexist within that at any given time, and how long will they be planned to last for. In reference to the size of the team, we've encountered several different kinds and sizes of embedded research teams. Sometimes just a single researcher working within a practice institution. Sometimes a researcher or researchers who are placed within practice institutions but with formal linear connections to people outside in research institutions. Or sometimes a more complicated kind of setup where you might have a team of people encompassing multiple connections and roles which are, who are more or less embedded in research and in practice contexts at different times. So it's a more kind of fluid arrangement. So PPI next. Next slide, Richard, thank you. Patient and public involvement. So embedded research generally involves multiple stakeholders, not just research people and practice people. And one group to emblematize this, and a group that is likely to need particular attention to their involvement is the group of service users and patients and publics. And again, this can be thought about in terms of scale and extent of involvement. And so given that PPI contributors are quite likely to be volunteers, it's important to make the best use of their time and effort. And this could mean their contributions are planned across the initiatives and across projects, or perhaps at more specific times and specific places. And so the type of the contribution expected from PPI collaborators, where will they be helpful? Will it be in planning a project? Will it be in helping to collect data or analyze data? Or will it be more in terms of reacting and responding to results and outcomes? And finally, one should think about what will be the mechanisms of these PPI contributions. So many practice institutions may already have pathways in place. Can you hear me okay? May have pathways in place for engaging with these kinds of groups of people. And then in planning a project or initiative, you need to ask whether those pathways will be sufficient for what's needed, or whether new mechanisms and pathways need to be developed and put in place. Onwards to proximity. Thanks, Richard. So alongside these initiative level and project level concerns that I've spoken about, we can think also about the individual researcher themselves and their proximity to the practice context in space and time. So in terms of place and space, where will the researcher be physically located when they are embedded? Will they have designated restricted access to specific areas and points? So maybe that might be purely for the purposes of collecting data. And will they have a more regular presence in practice? So maybe they might have their own desk in a practice institution or another allocated space that's theirs. And in that case, where precisely will that be? And how will that positioning allow and facilitate the researchers to do the work that they need to do? Or will they have a more integral kind of presence? So maybe there might be multiple sites of contact with practice and with practitioners and with stakeholders. Time-wise, we can ask what proportion of time embedded researchers would spend in the embedded state. So would this be all of their time, 100%, or some known fraction of their time that's planned for? And will this vary across a project? So does there have to be greater intensity of exposure at the start of a project, for example? Home, lastly, is an idea that we think is useful for evoking the experiences of being an embedded researcher, having a sense of being in the right place, and asking how this is formalized and operationalized. So being at home may be operationalized and expressed formally in contracts and job descriptions. And likely it will be connected to the source of funding that supports the researcher. So how is that funding routed to be where it needs to be? And also to accountability. So to whom is the researcher primarily accountable, and who line manages them in the different institutions they may be connected to? Who else bears responsibility for their work? And lastly, how is being at home something more informal that exists in performance and which is enacted? And so this has to do a lot more with interpersonal relationships and styles of interaction, and be associated with emotions such as trust and loyalty and a sense of attachment. And again, this sense of home, being at home, is likely to be something that varies over time and may take quite a long time to nurture. So these finishing with these quite individual matters of identity creation, we can hopefully see how they are connected and linked with design choices for the project that need to be considered early on when formulating it, when thinking how it's going to work. So that covers the main considerations of how we would think about structuring embedded research. And now Tricia can step in and talk more about the processes of embedded research and what embedded researchers do.
Great, thank you, Bennett. So the third and final broad category that we've identified as helpful to consider when designing an embedded research initiative is this category of processes. Processes are that which focus on the kinds of engagement, activities, and interactions that would be envisioned within establishing an initiative. And there are four aspects, as you'll see the icons represent here. The first one we'll talk about is the activities, and that's the icon with the jack of all trades person juggling many various particular aspects of their role. Second would be the researcher expertise and skills, and that includes what is in the brain of the researcher. And third would be the learning mechanisms. And the fourth with the various hats that are related there regard to what role are they wearing as they engage in their work. So let's move to the first slide there for processes, which it covers activities. Now this covers the functional and concrete work that the embedded researcher does. And we've identified 5 particular areas of how to group these various activities, and the first one would be organizing and managing. Now this involves organizing meetings and other ways of linking people together, but also the project management aspects of the embedded research work. And this is including overseeing staff as well as budgets and, again, the project management. The second area we've called teaching, and this gets to the development, the capacity building of others, such as mentoring and providing feedback. Facilitating a journal club, perhaps, we found is a common way, as well as running research seminars. The third activity we've labeled analyzing, and this gets to the more formal research work that includes reviewing materials and conducting, many we found are conducting ethnographic types of research within the embedded organization in which they're embedded. And the fourth would be sharing. Now this category speaks to the way that the embedded researchers engage in a reciprocal process of both giving and receiving information, and through both formal as well as informal dissemination processes. And the final area of activities that we've identified has been around creating. Now this is capitalizing on the embedded researcher's perspective, new perspective, to spark ideas, to problem solve, to contribute to decision making and inspire new ways of thinking.
And on the next slide, we'll look to speak to the researcher's expertise and skills. Now, when designing a research initiative, it's important to think about the kinds of skills the researcher needs in order to conduct the work that we've just described. And specifically, do they need to bring the generic or broad research, overarching research skills, or is it really essential that they have specific content expertise to be able to make the initiative run? Now, the third would be that on the next slide there, Richard, that looks to the learning mechanisms. Now, learning mechanisms, these are the ideas that the initiative uses both to monitor as well as to learn about itself. So what are the mechanisms in place that we have identified in the literature as well as in the initiatives going on are threefold, both the informal and times of reflection to get a sense of how things are going, the formal evaluations, as well as the products that often come out in the key performance indicators. And these three mechanisms help stakeholders get a sense of how the initiative is achieving its aims and objectives. And finally, the fourth would be the relational role. Now, the relational role considers the way that the researcher engages with the embedded environment and gets to the messy complexities that we found both in the literature and in many of the interviews. Now, we've identified three particular ways of capturing this within the relational role. And the first is considering the anticipated level of independence between the researcher and the organization. And the question here gets to whether the researcher is embedded as an insider or as an outsider. We've often found that that's a careful and tricky line that many of the researchers have had to walk. And while this gets to issues of home that Bennett spoke of related to belonging and loyalty, it has practical implications around data access and the freedom around disseminating the research results. The second area of relational role is what we're calling issues of stance. Now, this means, does the researcher come into the environment as a friendly and safe sounding board, or on the other end, are they intended to have a more critical and questioning role? So, for example, do they primarily fulfill the role of an advocate, a critical friend, or are they there to evaluate the service organization? And the final area that we've looked at with relational role has to do with the kinds of input that the researcher is expected. And the question here is, are they bringing a fresh pair of eyes to the organization or another pair of arms? Some examples that we found include providing specialist information, expert advice, being able to be a creative muse, perhaps, to those within the organization, but others are very much engaged in conducting the work of the service organization. So ideally, for the design purposes, the processes of the initiative are in alignment with the other areas that Bennett and Vicky have described. So the processes are supported by the structures in the course of meeting the intent of the work.
Trisha, thank you very much. Trisha, Bennett, Hugh, Vicky, a wonderful run through. I think we have to compliment both your colour scheme and your icons as well, and certainly adding to it. So thank you very much indeed. I'm sure
we can't take the credit for those icons, though. That they have been produced by a wonderful designer by the name of Rebecca Partridge, who's based at Sheffield Hallam University. So thank you to Becca enormously for producing those wonderful icons.
And Trisha, picking up your point, I think lots of people will be going, now, am I an eye or an arm? What body parts do I play? We'll come on to questions and how to get involved in just a second. But Vicky, I just wondered if you want to say what happens next. Sort of fascinating stuff, but where's this going? What are you doing with it?
So I'm sure that you're all expecting me to say, actually, now what we're doing is we're going to write some clever.
Vicky, we've lost you for one. Vicky, we lost you just for a moment when you're getting to the critical bit.
Let me retry again with that. Yes, I'm sure you're all expecting that I'm going to say that we're going to produce some wonderful research publications from this and really increase our impact of this research. But those of you who know me will know that actually what we're trying to do and what we're wanting to do next with this is something really quite practical. And to that end, we've got a workshop happening at the start of February, and we've invited a number of people to join us in that workshop to look at these different, this these different areas, these different design options, to actually help us to design something that will be useful and practical for those who are wanting to get started in embedded research, particularly those who are looking to design an initiative. So the workshop's going to be a co-creation workshop. We already have a number of people who are coming to help us with that, who are involved in embedded research, which is fantastic. And so the outcome from that workshop is going to be something, we don't know what because it's a co-creation workshop. It's going to be something, some kind of product or tool, which people will hopefully be able to use to help them to design embedded research initiatives. So it's very much a case of these are our initial insights. This is what, we've got some pretty icons, but we don't expect these to stay the same. So very much do watch this space. If you're looking for a practical tool, that's what we're aiming to be developing next, alongside the academic publications, of course.
Yes, if you don't like practical tools, I'm sure there'll be other things you can read as well. What other such things? Vicky, thank you very much indeed. Alison, do you just want to remind people how to get involved?
Sure. You can use the Ask Question feature in the chat box, and I'm sure most of you have seen I'm replying to your questions as you send them in and storing them away to ask the team at St. Andrews later. You can email us at hello@kaleidoscope.healthcare. You can also tweet us. The username is _embedded, and we're using the hashtag embedded research today.
So thank you very much. And to say, if you are joining at a later point, that Ask Question feature probably not going to be as useful, but please, of course, do feel free to share your thoughts, reflections via Twitter, or you're very welcome to email us. So I think questions are starting to come through, but if I could just throw one in using Chair's prerogative before we come to those. So a question for Vicky, which is really interesting in terms of sort of the range of schemes which are out there and the sort of range of different ways in which they vary. Yeah, did you get a sense in the work to date about whether these existing schemes have arisen by thoughtful consideration of all of these design options, or just by accident? So are people already thinking through these different dimensions, or are things sort of the way they are because that's just how they happened?
I think you won't be surprised to hear that the majority of initiatives have just happened. And that's actually why we have come at our around with the aim of providing people with something that can help them to think through these options. Because the thing that we found when these initiatives kind of bubble up and just emerge from practice, what often happens is that they're not necessarily very consistent. So they might be intended to there'll be a grand aim of disrupting power balances and trying to rebalance things very much between the different partners. But actually the knowledge producer, the researcher, will still be being employed by an academic institution and will be being expected to produce generalizable forms of knowledge. And those things seem sometimes a bit inconsistent. So that's why we think that having this framework will be potentially useful, because it will help people to think through some of those things in advance, which most people aren't necessarily doing at the moment.
Excellent, great. And just very quick question for Hugh, and then we will move on, if that's okay. Hugh, and anything being which you found particularly surprising from this work today, having got under the skin of what these schemes are doing, how they're different? Is it largely as you would have expected? Does anything jump out as being a bit different?
No, I think there were many surprises that we got as a team, and certainly that I felt in the work that we uncovered. So I was surprised at the extent and the diversity of the schemes that were already out there, and I was surprised at the scale of some of these, both in terms of their longevity in some cases, and also in terms of the number of people that were involved and the scope of what it was they were trying to do. And it's from that natural diversity that we're able to explore some of these different dimensions or different design issues. And it's been particularly helpful being able to combine insights from a literature that tends to dig deeper into the conceptual underpinnings and the thinking and the theories behind it, and tries to link these schemes into strands of thought around how we mobilize knowledge and why knowledge gets stuck, or why knowledge of certain forms is difficult to communicate or difficult to share, to link that with the very practical experience of these schemes and the schemes' protagonists. So putting these two things together has given us many new insights, I think.
Hugh, great. I'm sure there'll be other people who'll be following up some of those surprises as we go through. Alison, questions coming through?
Yeah, on the theme of surprising, Jackie asks why, Vicky, it was a surprise to you that embedded researchers are employed by universities or by the NHS. Where did you expect them to have been employed? And what are the other options outside of universities or the NHS? And again, on the subject of surprises, I was quite surprised that prestige and credibility of the organization was a consideration. And I'd like to flip that and ask, what can the organization do to take into account prestige and credibility of the researcher? Because I know that that has been an ongoing theme throughout this embedded project.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, great questions. Why was the employment status a surprise? I think actually going back to webinar 1, when we considered a paper that was published by a number of different researchers who've been involved in embedded research initiatives, and a paper that was put together by Naomi Fulop and her team and Cecilia Vindrola. Actually, one of the markers of an embedded researcher, they said in that paper from the work that they'd looked at, was a joint contract. So what we expected was to see many more people with joint contracts, with formal joint contracts, where a university and a health service organisation took joint responsibility for employing that researcher. And so it was a surprise that we didn't have more of those, really, I think. And so it was quite a surprise that it seemed to be one or the other, not both, because one of the ideas of embedded research is about blending and bringing organisations together. But that's something that we don't necessarily see in the structure, in the way that things are organised structurally, which was really interesting. The prestige and credibility of the researcher, that's a really interesting point, Alison. I think that what we're very much doing in our part of the work was we were focusing at the level of the initiative. So we weren't necessarily focusing on individual researchers. And so you'll notice that we do have things on the relational role of the researcher, but we don't necessarily have things around how an individual researcher operates within that setting. And the prestige and credibility of the researcher wasn't something that came out enormously in the interviews, in the documents, or in the literature necessarily. And what we would have been considering in this part of the work is how an organisation supports the development perhaps of the researcher and their prestige and credibility, how they encourage and nurture that. And there was relatively limited information available there. It just wasn't something that came out from our data. So it's an interesting question to pose, but it just wasn't really there in what we were seeing to date. But that's certainly something I think that the team moving on from us and what happens next with Justin Waring and Naomi Fulop and the work they're doing, that will certainly be something that they'll be looking to pick up there.
Vicky, thank you very much. Questions flooding in.
Yeah, actually questions are flooding in. Andrew asks, and I don't know who's the best to answer this question, is it valuable to add a category to research funding to bid for funding as an embedded researcher? And Peter asks, I guess you guys can all think of this together and maybe you each have a different answer. Which design features are the most dominant, and which design features do you think are perhaps the most important across the 45 initiatives? Great
questions. Who'd like to start? Really interesting question for Andrew. So I was sort of saying, is there a sort of a competitive advantage from saying I'm applying for this as an embedded researcher? Hugh, do you want to pick that one up? And then I wonder if you want to go to Bennett and Tricia about these dominant features.
So it's an interesting question as to whether or not this was an outcome or benefit that was being sought to generate new revenue streams for the organisation. And I'm interested to see what Vicky has to say about the interviews that she carried out with the scheme protagonist, to see whether that was something that came up and could be slotted in there or not. What's interesting about the second question about which design features are dominant, which design features are important, I'm sure that varies hugely between the different schemes. Some of them are relatively easy and straightforward to think about, who's going to be involved over what kind of time period, where are they going to be located, what will be the, if you like, the rules of engagement. Those things are relatively easy to talk about and to surface. But one of the things we were keen to do with this work was to try to surface some of the things that are often less explicit, that are about the underlying assumptions that have been made about what the role will do, the preferences that people have about the role of power, for example, and any rebalancing that might go on. And so we hope that the way in which we've structured this and the focusing in on these different design elements will bring to the fore aspects of design that are more latent in people's discussions, that are more alluded to, and make them, by making them more explicit, we can make more informed choices.
Thank you very much.
And to speak as well, to the initiatives, I think what we found, both in the literature as well as in the initiatives that are ongoing, is that oftentimes it's worked backwards. So people have begun with a general idea, but not articulated, and have begun engaging in perhaps setting contracts and setting up some of the particular, or some aspects of the structure, but then they get going on the processes, and they begin figuring out what the work is, and maybe organizing, some tracking mechanisms and whatnot. But at the main contribution, I think, that we have seen so far that these design initiative or these design aspects can make is that when you begin when you begin to outline what the intent is, so what is it you're trying to do explicitly, and what is it that you're trying to, who's going to contribute, and so outlining the original goals helps to identify then the structures and processes that need to be put in place, rather than the tail wagging the dog. So finding that it tends to work the other way, and then people are wondering, why is it that they're not getting the benefits and outcomes that they're really trying to go after? But it's only after the fact, or sometimes later, I suppose, is as the initiative moves along. I don't know if you have any comments to add to that, but
yeah, I'd agree. Really, in terms of the most dominant or the most important design feature, I think the most important is the one that's the least dominant when you speak to people. So I think really the most important is around intent. So it's around the intended effect on the partners, the intended effect on their relationships, the intended outcome or benefit. Those things tend, as Tricia says, not to be articulated, but those are the things which drive the rest of the work. So people are quite happy to talk about the most dominant things. So they're quite happy to talk about structure. They're quite happy to talk about processes. And when I say to people, well, so what did you set out to achieve? And what was the underlying intent? And were there any intended effects on how the partners related to one another? Those things are much more difficult for people to talk about, but do really influence everything else that comes afterwards, really.
Mm-hmm.
Lastly, Bennett, themes which you saw coming.
I'll just add to that so interestingly how that we've come up with these 10 kind of dimensions of different perspectives on design, which, as my colleague is saying, often came out afterwards, or we would be reading them between the lines of what was written and spoken about embedded research, and we're now presenting them in a kind of forward-thinking way. So we're saying these are things you must think about before, so as you plan, but that doesn't mean they aren't still revisable all the way through. So you may well begin your embedded research initiative with a certain kind of set of values and plans in place. But what the 10 dimensions does is give you a way of ordering your thoughts, so that when things then change or things happen that are unforeseen, you can organize your thoughts in response, and so have a kind of methodical way of thinking about it. So yeah, I hope that adds something.
Really nice point, and I'm sure everyone joining will be shocked to hear that some people have pretended that everything they've done was perfectly designed, rather than a series of happenstance. That certainly has never happened with us, and I'm sure it's never happened with you either. Does this sort of stuff happen? But a really nice point that there's real value here in people sort of thinking about embedded research projects, building on the experience, both of what we see in the literature, but all those existing schemes to sort of create initiatives which are going to better be able to meet that purpose, which Tricia, you were talking about earlier. We've got about 13 minutes left, precisely. More questions, Alison?
Oh.
Should we take a couple?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions about definitions as you're going through, so it's kind of some technical questions. Mandy wants to know how you defined community in your relating to your initiatives. Tim wants to know, what do you see the difference between an embedded researcher and a clinical academic? Is there a difference? Annette would like to know how you discovered these initiatives and if others could go about discovering other initiatives. And
one more.
Sure. The last question comes from Peter. Did the scoping and interviews unearth any unintended consequences?
Lovely. Awesome. Thank you very much indeed. Who'd like to start? Vicky, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think most of those might be for me. Yeah, I think particularly because a lot of them do relate to the technicalities of doing the scoping work that we did, and some of the interviews and the definitions. So how do we define community? That's a really good question. Thank you, Mandy. I'm just trying to remember now off the top of my head. I think what we were looking at was community healthcare settings. So that would include public health, because we didn't want to have that as a separate broad category. So we broadly looked at acute settings, so hospitals, acute services, community, primary care is much more defined, I think, than community. But community is those kind of community health initiatives, so quite broad in scope. And if you want to email me any questions about that, please feel free, and then I can actually have a root around in my database and give you some more specific answers around that. Tim's question about the difference between embedded researchers and clinical academics. Tim, that's something I grappled with long and hard in thinking about this and how we would define an embedded researcher. And at the end of the day, it came down to the researcher needing to be involved in knowledge creation whilst being embedded in the setting within which they, so in their host setting. And what we found was that a number of people who have a role as clinical academics, and are very specifically clinical academics, we found that a number of people put hats on and off at different points in time. And so some people, whilst they were in their university setting, were very much operating as a researcher. They were very much being an academic, but then in the service setting, they were more often operating in that very clinical, hands-on setting. And their research work was not necessarily very closely linked to their clinical work. So we do have some clinical academics who we have defined as embedded researchers, but that was done through talking with them via email and exploring a little bit more about which of the categories and boxes they were ticking. So I think we had 3 ways of defining an embedded researcher. They were involved in knowledge production. They were embedded in a host organisation for a significant period of their time, and that's of their working week. So that helps us to distinguish between people who were perhaps doing ethnographic field work and then taking the data away and going back to the university. And I can't now off the top of my head at all remember what the third one was, but I'm pretty sure it's in webinar 2 if you wanted to have a quick look at that, or again just drop me an email. Very practical question. How did we discover the initiatives? Email and Twitter is the answer. We actually used one of the really good ways that we had was the chain email network. We put a message out via that and had lots and lots of responses. We used Twitter. I've got a reasonable sized Twitter following. We asked people to tweet and retweet on our behalf as well. And we just went out to lots of people who we already knew. And finally, the scoping interviews, were there any unintended consequences? I don't think there were necessarily. I think what's been really nice with having done the scoping and the interview work, what's been really nice is we've started to identify people who seem to want to be part of a community. They've remained engaged with us. They have, been very generous with time, very generous with sending us information and documents, and very interested and intrigued to continue to find out about what we're doing. So that's been really nice, actually, just a way of identifying people who want to gain some support. And so it wasn't unintended in many ways. It was something which we intended was to offer a source of networking as well for people. But it was a pleasant, not a pleasant surprise. It was just a pleasant thing that happened. I think is that actually a good consequence of doing the work was identifying people who seemed to want to remain engaged with us, which was great.
Lovely, Vicky. Trisha, Bennett, you anything to add on those set of questions?
Yeah, just telling unintended consequences thing. So a big part of my job has been reading through all academic literatures around co-production, and in those, the idea of the unintended consequence gets quite a lot of play, and is often quite celebrated. So people will report sort of co-production and embedded initiatives and say, "Oh, and look at all these wonderful unintended consequences," and then it slides round so that people are beginning to suggest you can plan, because knowing that you'll get unintended consequences, in which case they're not quite unintended really by that point. So there's a bit of slipperiness to it, and I suppose as we find out more from literatures and build our framework around what can be gained from this kind of boundary crossing operation, there'll be less and less space for unintentional consequences, I think, maybe. So yeah, it's an interesting paradox to think about that.
One of the things I'd throw in is that I'm most interested to see how this develops is the case study work that Naomi and Justin are going to be leading on, because I think there's great opportunities in there to dig deeper with the participants and find out what kind of things emerged in the practice of those particular embedded research initiatives that were unexpected and unintended. And I would expect there will be a range from the wonderful to the darker and slightly more disturbing. So I think there's lots of things to explore there. Good things that can happen in services, good things that can happen to relationships and to identities, but also some quite challenging things I would expect that will happen to identities, to careers and the like. And I'm hoping the case studies will dig into some of those areas as well.
Gee, that sounds like a trailer for some, keep with us on
Yeah.
Rediscover the disturbing truth. Right.
Well, no, it isn't always the case that everything in the garden is rosy. So you can always plan for things. So.
Coming to an embedded research webinar near you. Thank you all. Thank you for everyone's questions. We're fast approaching 3 o'clock. So before we close, I will, and just to give our panelists some advance notice, I'll just come round, all of us, if that's okay. It'd be great just to get one closing reflection from our 4 panelists and from Alison as well. We'll go first here to buy St Andrews colleagues some time. But before we do that, just so I misspoke earlier. I said this was the 2nd webinar in the series. Of course, it is the 3rd. So if you have missed the previous 2 webinars, do go back and look at those. Again, all of the information about the project is available on the Embedded website, which is
embeddedresearch.org.
Thank you very much, Alison. Closing reflections. So I'll start, then Alison, then we'll go Hugh, Bennett, Trisha, and then Vicky will give you the last word. So one reflection from me, it's a similar point actually to what I think we made in the last webinar, which is it's obvious that you've found a huge range of schemes, and that enthusiasm for being part of something bigger is certainly told just by the number of people who are tuning into this webinar series, which is great to see. So going back to Vicky's point, you want this to be practical. It is very clear that there's quite an audience for engaging in this debate, being part of this community, which is lovely to see. Alison.
What struck me is that a lot of the themes that came up in your search of what an organization or what an initiative should consider, I think is actually what any employer should consider when they're hiring any other human employee. The concept of home and of interpersonal relationships and power dynamics. Those are really human qualities, and I think this kind of knowledge could really be applicable to a wider audience than just the embedded research audience.
Awesome, lovely, thank you. Hugh.
Well, thanks very much. I mean, I'd say it in 3 parts, really. One is there is a logic and a rationale that underpins these kinds of initiatives, and I think that makes them very exciting. The second is that they're very diverse, though, and how they play out is very, very variable, and that we've focused on many of the different design issues. And then the lesson I would draw from that is that we can develop tools that can help that planning process while still being alert to the possibilities of emergence and the unexpected.
If you ask an academic to give one closing reflection, it comes in.
We're closely linked, I like to think.
Bennett.
Yeah, I'll just give a simple closing reflection, which is simply that the workshop, which I believe is 2 weeks today, if my calendar's right. So I'm very much looking forward to that and to meeting people who are involved in the kind of things that we've been researching, that I've been reading about. And really excited about that in London in a couple of weeks. That'll be good.
Thank you. Tricia.
Well, I think what's most fascinated me in the course of working in this particular team has been taking from the literature. I've been looking at the embedded initiative research literature in the health fields as well as elsewhere in different sectors, and to see the common challenges that people have had, whether it's health, whether it's parks in South Africa, whether it's, no matter where people are at, some of the difficult issues around finding their particular place in space and the struggle of being part of but not fully part of. And some of those challenges have really come clear in literature as well as in ways that we've seen. And what's interesting to see is sometimes those challenges are really linked to the lack of potential consideration around the structures that leave them in the limbo land, and the lack of consideration of the political and power dynamics and some of those things. So it's shown me the particular value of drawing these in more explicit ways to be considered, so that it helps both the researcher as well as the research initiative to be able to find, I think, a place that is more well defined and fits what it is that everyone's looking for. So,
Vicky.
I think in closing reflection, it was the question asked, I think, by Peter around the dominance or the importance of the particular of the different parts of the framework which we've come up with, and also Bennett's response to that, I think, was really illuminating, which is that we shouldn't get so bogged down with this is the way that you must design your embedded research initiative. Here is a manual for doing it. This is everything you must think about, and once you've decided things, that's it. It's set in stone. Actually, this is a tool and this is a framework for thinking. It's for thinking about things and considering them in advance of doing. But then the point that Bennett raised, it's so important to continue to reflect on what you are doing as you are going, and actually to remain flexible. So even if you've decided that this should be in your intended outcome or benefit, actually changing that as you go along, there's no bad thing in that. It's just important to continue that process of thinking about what you're doing, I think, in anything in life, but particularly when you're thinking about an embedded researcher initiative, when you're bringing together partners from very different environments very often.
Hugh, Bennett, Tricia, Vicky, thank you very much. Lovely closing reflections and a really nice walkthrough across the webinar of a fascinating topic. Just to say, we've hit 3 o'clock. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. If you have further thoughts and reflections following the webinar, please do send them through. That email address again is hello@kaleidoscope.healthcare, or go onto the Embedded Research website, embeddedresearch.org. We will leave it for today. We hope to see you at a future webinar. Thank you very much, all.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Goodbye.